contact.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are proud to welcome you to the second collaboration between Simonis Storm and Nedbank on live streaming the just read budget by the new Minister of Finance, Honorable Ipumbu Shimi. My name is Bruce Hansen and I'm from Simonis Storm, and I'll be the moderator today. And with me, I have three distinguished guests with me, and they will help me unpack what the Minister said in the budget. So please welcome Dr. Edward Turner from Nedbank, and he's the head of Nedbank Corporate and Investment Banking. And Eddie, we'll call him Eddie during the discussions, and Eddie will represent business as well. And then I have Klaus Schade. Klaus Schade is an independent economist, and Klaus, very welcome to you as well. And then on this side, I have the only lady. I have Dr. Jess De Beer from UNAM. She's a lecturer in economics. Jess, also very welcome to you. Eddie, very welcome to you. I think I missed saying that to you. Now, the Minister of Finance had a very difficult task today to present the budget whilst we are amidst the crisis whilst we are in an economic and health crisis. And so it was not an easy task for him. Namibia had a growth rate of minus 1.1% in 2019, and we also had our own domestic challenges before COVID arrived at our shores. Unsustainable high expenditure levels, increasing budget deficit, size of the public wage bill, slow implementation of necessary reforms to bolster growth, and then in between we also had a couple of droughts. And then the Minister gives us a 12-month budget. So I would like to kick off and ask my panelists here, what were your first impressions of this budget? So Eddie, maybe I'll start with you on that side.
Okay, let me start with the positive. I think the positive is that there were no major changes to tax, to income tax, also no changes to that. So for the consumer out there, it is a good budget. It will not really touch your pocket on the tax side. The one thing I do need to mention is I was expecting a bit more on the policy framework, because if you look at it, this budget was very much a COVID-19 budget because of all the focus on health expenditure. So now the question is, pre-COVID, we've been through 3 years of consecutive economic contraction. Mm-hmm. And we had a lot of talk about the policy framework, how we're going to invite more investment into the country, what we're going to do about a new economic equity framework, and things like that for me was a bit lacking here. Mm-hmm. I do recognize it's a COVID-19 budget, which I think we can discuss in more detail, because I think that would be the gist of what we discussed this afternoon. But my view also, and if you go to the last quote on what we do in a crisis, for me a crisis, you need to really elevate yourself beyond your current scenario. Mm-hmm. And for us to elevate ourselves beyond that, we can't be reactionary. We need to react, but beyond that, we need to say what are the proactive decisions we're already taking now, that when we're out of it, we're stronger than ever. And mm-hmm. that's not created by just being reactionary.
Okay. Thank you, Eddie. Klaus?
Yeah, Eddie has almost said everything. It's a one-year budget. It's an unusual budget because usually the Minister of Finance tables a 3-year rolling budgets and medium-term expenditure framework. But given the uncertainties and probably also the lack of consultations within cabinet because of the lockdown and social distancing and so a lot of these policy issues remain vague and will be addressed, as he mentioned, in the mid-year budget review, so probably in 5 months' time that we'll hear more details. Also on expenditure side, and so not too many details were revealed about the allocation of the budget, not only to certain votes, but also to budget items. And I think the main issue here are policy issues. How do we get out in the medium term out of the increasing debt, out of the increasing deficit that amounts to about 20 billion? How do we finance this huge budget deficit? Is there enough liquidity in the domestic market? How much do we need to borrow from other markets and so on? These details are not mentioned in this statement.
Okay. Jess?
Yes, I also really just want to echo what Klaus and Eddie has said, and to come back to the idea of a crisis budget, a one-year budget, but what we really need to think about is what will happen after next year or after this year. So we have said the budget deficit this year is about $20 billion as compared to $7 billion the previous year. So we would expect that in a time of crisis, and the figures that the minister have shown us is that revenue has decreased dramatically, especially for things like value-added tax, company tax, and individual income tax. But going forward, we would need to find ways to grow GDP, to grow our economy in order to be able to repay the debt and to service the interest on this huge deficit and this huge debt.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that we're looking at a crisis budget, and we've probably expected the minister to say a little bit more in terms of how would our situation look after COVID. So once we've stemmed the health crisis, how do we now go forward? Because we have been in an economic crisis. Eddie, you've mentioned it. We've been in that in that mode already. So there are some issues that we need to sort out. Understandably, we need to now look at the budget at this crisis situation and address the crisis situation, but at the same time think about what will the future hold. So because I would like to explore that a little bit more, but before we do that, maybe just if we can get a sense of the numbers. Yeah. So Klaus, if you can just give us talk to us about the revenue, the expenditure, and the deficit, and to the viewers, what does this really mean? If we talk about revenue and expenditure more than revenue, and you sit in a deficit, what does it mean, especially for the man on the street?
Oh, okay. Just to repeat the numbers, in last year's budget, the expenditure was estimated at about 67.1 billion for the new financial year, the current financial year. This amount has been increased to 72.8 billion Namibia dollar, an increase of almost 8.5%. And at the same time, as Jesse said already, pressure on income tax, on company tax, on VAT, and a number of other taxes as well, royalties, mining royalties, and so they all have decreased because of production stops and so on. Revenues are expected to come in lower by about 14%. based on the estimates. The estimates for this year were 59 billion or 60 billion almost. It's now down to 51.4 billion. And that leaves the deficit at about 20 billion Namibia dollar. Of course, that has an implication for overall debt. Our debt burden to GDP is about to increase to 68%. So way above our own internal targets of 35%, but also of international benchmarks and the SADC convergence criteria that also set a maximum of 60%. I think all these figures are, of course, not cast in stone, and in these unprecedented times, I don't see a major challenge in exceeding these targets, as long as we have a clear strategies how we over the next couple of years reduce the burden again. And the debt burden stands now at about 117.5 billion Namibia dollar, up from an estimated 105 billion Namibia dollar. As it's always said, as long as you borrow and you invest in assets, or you create assets, you build infrastructure, roads or transport infrastructure, education infrastructure, schools, health infrastructure, and so on, it can be justified because you expect a return, and you, as I said, you build assets. But over the past couple of years, we have used the borrowed funds already to pay for operational expenses. And this is especially the case now during this year. And the gap between the capital budget and the borrowing amounted to about, we just check, 11 billion some years ago. It has been brought down already, so there were efforts to rein in expenditure, but still the borrowed funds exceed the capital budget, especially this year, by far. And I think that is another benchmark where we need to focus on to bring that, let's say, into positive territory again.
Before I move on, maybe from the two other panelists, do you have any strong feelings around, lower revenue, higher expenditure, and then therefore a higher budget deficit, and the financing of that that deficit?
One idea that we should not lose track of is that there's economic impact for Namibia from internal factors and external factors. So the impact on our tourism we should not underestimate. And I think tourism, I guess, is about 10% of our GDP. And with the lack of foreign tourists now, that is a significant impact on economic activity. But that has a spin-off effect locally, because that revenue from tourism is again utilized in the country to stimulate other industries and households to have a sustainable living. And you see that reflected in that going down, income and corporate tax also. And that impact is significant. I'm not sure if we've mentioned the numbers, but that estimated to go down 32%.
Yep.
Individual tax 20%, corporate tax 25%. And wasn't it for the SACU revenues, which we expect to be higher, the 51 billion of revenue would even have been lower. So that's also a positive that we can take from this, that the SACU revenues in that sense is a little bit of a saving grace.
Yep.
The issue will be next year, because the lower trade this year will then be reflected in next year's SACU revenues probably being lower. So it's so important for us to recover economically that we get the taxes up, specifically the individual and corporate taxes, because that is an indication of economic activity, which really drive a country to get out of a deficit position or to decrease a deficit position.
Jess, anything that you want to add on that?
No, I just also want to echo that next year, we've said this is a one-year budget, but there would be a hangover next year.
Yeah.
And one of the things is that definitely next year the SARCO transfer would be considerably lower.
Yeah.
And if we don't know, again, the uncertainty, we don't know when we will be able to welcome foreign tourists again, for instance, and when regional trade will go back to normal, even if it's a new normal. So we don't know what will happen to revenue next year, but probably next year it will still be a big issue.
Yeah.
But if I may, I think often when we think about tourism, we think about campsites, lodges, restaurants. But tourism affects many more sectors, including financial sectors, foreign exchange, ICT, use of internet, and so on, and car rental companies, and so it really has an impact on various other economic sector. And tourism is also important in Namibia because it channels cash into remote areas. Lodges are often far outside any towns, and it's often the only cash income in these areas that are generated by lodges that then demand maybe vegetable and so from community gardens, the community conservancies that receive millions in fees from tour operators and hunters and so on. So it really has an impact on society, communities, and various economic sectors. But this is mostly out of our own control because it depends on the regulations in other countries, whether some visitors have to go back into quarantine when they return from Namibia. So we can put a lot of effort here into, but if there are very restrictive regulations in case in our main sources from tourists, it will be challenging to attract tourists here.
Perfect. Eddie, I want to put you on the spot because I remember last year, you know, as a person that's in business and running a business, you were talking about the business environment. You were talking about incentives for business, and I want you to talk a little bit on that, but also talk us through some of the tax, you know, because if we talk about revenue and we talk about tax, what did you make? And you've mentioned in your introduction, you've mentioned something on tax. So talk us through those tax, the tax statements that were made, and also just maybe talk a little bit about that, the incentives for business.
Bruce, your memory is very good to remember what I said last year. It feels like ages ago. In any event, I think last year we were a bit stressed because there were several possible tax amendments to come through, and some of them have been repealed, and some of them now will be under review. So, for instance, one that is withdrawn is the disallowance of the tax deductibility of royalties for mining entities. So that is a good sign for mining entities. There was also the repealing of some of the tax exemptions on corporate tax and tax incentives for manufacturers and exporters. That in its entirety will now be replaced by something which is more positive, the introduction of special economic zones. We still need to see the details of that, but that's a positive sign for business. Then on the income tax and value added tax, VAT side, there are a few things which will be reviewed. And one of them is the dividend tax for residents, which I see as a good positive. Then last year there was also ideas about the conduit principle to be cancelled for trust. That is the principle that you can transfer income through a trust to the individuals so that they are taxed and they can basically utilize that against expenses. They wanted to cancel that, but that is now again under review. And there was also talk about income tax on the commercial income for charities. That is also being reviewed now. Specifically, if we look at churches, where they have a significant drop, because as we all know, since middle of March, there were no church gatherings allowed, and that has a significant impact on church income. So now to again tax their commercial income from property rental, for instance, will not be such a good thing. And there are one or two other things. Is also the introduction of that on the income of listed asset managers, which is also under review. And then there was an idea to zero rate VAT on sugar, and also some mandatory issue on the issuing of tax invoice. That is also being reviewed. And I think it's a good thing at this point in time, because as I think we would agree, this is not really a tax budget this year. It is a COVID budget. It's a crisis budget. It is also, in a sense, a budget to make us aware now is the time to really consider change. And with reference to the quote from, I think, Milton Friedman, used by the Honourable Minister.
Okay, great. I would like to move on to the expenditure side, just so that we touch all areas. Maybe just on your side, in terms of expenditure and the increase in expenditure, do you think that was warranted? And the allocation of that, was the allocation at the right places? What's your take on that?
Thanks, Bruce. Maybe just to first say something about the increase in expenditure, the absolute amounts from about 65 billion to about 72.8 billion. And if the Minister, Honourable Minister, also breaks it down into non-interest operational spending, and we can see that from that alone we can see that the interest payment on debt is quite high. So, but where did the extra spending go to? I just want to mention a few figures. So if we look at the individual allocations, so health and social services have received about 1 billion more, and basic education about 400 million. The poverty eradication allocation has increased from 3.6 billion to 5.3 billion. So we can see the crisis budget. So just a few individual figures. The emergency income grant is about $772 million. The special allocations to schools to sanitize and to hospitals to be ready for COVID is about 700 million and 600 million respectively. But just to put that a little bit into perspective, so of our $72.8 billion of spending, 30 billion goes to wages of civil servants. So we've been talking about this for quite some time. And at the end of his speech, the Honourable Minister also mentioned that that is a longer term issue and that needs to be addressed. The public service needs to be right sized. So, and another thing maybe to put it into perspective, the payment on interest on debt this year is about 8 billion Namibian dollars. And just interesting, payment for CMS, the medical scheme, 2.6 billion. So we see considerable amounts direct spending related to COVID, but we also see some other quite big numbers in the budget.
Klaus, you talked about if you borrow, or if you borrow money, that you at least use the money for productive purposes so you can get a return on that. What we're hearing here is that it seems operational expenditure again it has gotten a large pie. Now it could be because it's already, I almost want to use the word institutionalized, because it's already there. It becomes difficult to get rid of that. I know that you have thoughts probably around the development budget, and then also how that development budget, or at least funds from the development budget, maybe be used for some other purposes. So maybe if you can just talk around that. Okay, go.
I just wanted to mention a few more figures where I think we need to focus on in future. For instance, the Ministry of Urban and Rural Development receives about 800 million less than anticipated, down from 2.5 billion to 1.7 billion. And this ministry is responsible, amongst others, for water and sanitation. And I think especially the COVID crisis, although already hepatitis E has shown that we need to invest much more into water and sanitation. And I think that should be a priority over the next 5 years, that we really eradicate the lack of access to safe water and to sanitation, because that would make it a little bit easier, at least, to fight these communicable diseases. And also, surprisingly, agriculture receives now almost only 50% of the previous year's budget. This has been merged with land reform, and the total budget last year was about 2.8 billion. Now it's 1.3 billion, although forestry is taken out and allocated to environment and tourism. But okay, so there are also significant changes in some of the other ministries, among others also defense and veteran affairs, that has to do less by about 400 million. But coming back, I think it's very important. This is a crisis budget, but it has also shown that we need to invest much more into infrastructure. School infrastructure, we talk about e-learning and so, and we are still teaching learners under a tree in some areas. Yeah. So I think we need to close these gaps and at least provide schools with proper buildings, classrooms, including water and sanitation, what the Honorable Minister has mentioned, that should be a focus. But before water and sanitation, you need to have proper classrooms and ablution blocks and everything. But also electricity and then later access to ICT. Also, I think the huge increase for health and social services is not only because of COVID and testing facilities and all these related issues, but also because of a lack of health infrastructure. So again, this should be a priority going forward the next years. And then, of course, ICT provision across country, because it's not only for schools or education facilities, but also it reduces the necessity for face-to-face contacts. If you can fill in your application forms online, you submit everything online, it makes access to government services easier, let's say for business registration and so on, and it reduces the risk of all these communicable diseases that you might face if you have to go to an office and provide your hard copies and so on. And this could be kind of stimulus package. If we invest in infrastructure, we provide job opportunities in the construction sector and provide additional jobs. And there is nothing mentioned in this regard in the budget that government might implement another real stimulus package after evaluating the impact of the current one.
Okay, I would like to move on because I'm just aware of our time. Yeah. So the minister talked about how it, probably not talk, he made a statement that is it bilateral and multilateral and domestic sources will be used to finance the deficit. Yeah. Do you have any specific? Let me ask this: what does it mean if we say domestic sources? Where will this come from? Are we talking about the sinking fund? Are we talking about I don't know, Social Security? Maybe tapping into the VAT levy? Eddie, any thoughts around that?
And when you ask that question to a banker always want to create an asset and do some funding. And so in this case, it's a bit more complex, because I think the minister also said it will be from different sources. What I would have liked to see, but I think it's probably too close for them to ascertain that, is how the split will be between local and foreign funding. Because for foreign funding, we can perhaps have a discussion about approaching the IMF as a potential funder. And like for all lending, for me the issues are the terms. And the terms and conditions are not only the fine print, it's also the payment terms, the interest rate, and other suspensive conditions which may be in the contract. So it's important for us to get an understanding of that, or for me, more people to be aware of what lending does to your balance sheet. And so if I can just, and because we have lots of viewers, it's so important from this budget to realize you can't forever borrow yourself out of a problem, because it always brings more finance charges and more obligations. And if you don't have the revenue and productivity to sustain that, then you run into a problem. But I want to ask the other colleagues here to perhaps give their ideas more on the balance of the funding to cover the deficit.
Jess, any thoughts from your side? Where will we get funding from?
Yes, so the one thing I think that is on most people, or on a lot of people's minds, is what about an institution like the IMF? And we've talked about sort of the global positive sentiment, and like Eddie has also said, less terms and conditions applied to something like a loan from the IMF, because there's a lot of political resistance in African countries about approaching the IMF for financing. But this time around it seems to be different, that it won't be like in the past that you would have to adhere to certain economic policies that might harm the country over the longer term. So that is one possibility, to go to an institution like the IMF. But we have not heard anything about that, that Namibia wants to approach the IMF. So I suppose we'll have to wait and hear from the Honourable Minister what he is saying. So the other issue is the Eurobond that was issued in 2015, am I correct?
Yeah, I think it's
2011 and 2015.
Yes, two bonds. And to redeem that, because they are maturing now in the next year or so. So to be able to repay that, the government with the Bank of Namibia has created a so-called sinking fund. And the question is now, would that money maybe rather not be used to repay this loan now, to roll over this loan, to extend the maturity? So that is one option as well.
Okay, but it still seems a bit skimpy to me. We're talking about the IMF. We're talking about maybe a sinking fund. So to Eddie's point, how do you address something that you've built up for over many years? It is not something that you can wave away, within 1 year or 2 years. But I think, Klaus, you've also mentioned that we need to slowly start understanding that we have to build capacity in the country, capacity that will give us productive capacity, that will give us that return, so that we can start taking away some of that debt and get to more sustainable levels. And sustainable levels in terms of a Namibian situation. We talk about these benchmarks, 60% for SADC, etc. But is it 60% for Namibia? Can Namibia, for instance, carry that 60%? If we don't have on the other side of the equation, we don't have that income that comes in, that will sustain a 60%. So maybe we should be at 40%, or even lower. I'm just saying that one needs to be aware that once again emphasizing the point that let's build a productive capacity. Let's make sure that infrastructure is in place, so that we can be able to finance from domestic sources our deficit. What I would like to maybe just touch on again, because I would like to come back to the minister's the analogy that he used. I would like to talk a little bit about that, but let me put all of you on the spot now. Point 76. Such strategic priorities would entail, among others. And then the minister says, there's a team of experts appointed to carry out evidence-based research. This is now for economic diversification and structural transformation. Now, whenever I hear about evidence-based research, it's something that I like, because I would like us to, as a nation, build our decisions or make our decisions based on the research out there. Because how else would you make it? Otherwise you make it in the dark. So maybe just keep that. That was something that I felt was something positive from it. Improving national competitiveness. So provide policy certainty, boost investor confidence, and then it goes on improving tax compliance, public-private partnerships. That was also mentioned last year. Implementing integrated financing framework. Conducting an assessment to find sustainable and responsible strategy to right-size the public service. CMAS, strengthening of quality of public. So there's a whole list that the minister mentioned towards the end. These are the strategies. But if I look at that, it looks like strategies that we've always had. You can pick any of those, and you can say, but we've had it in last year's budget and maybe in previous budgets. What needs to happen, gentleman and lady? What needs to happen so we can say, right, we've actually implemented the specific strategy? Because I understand the new minister, probably wants to shake up a little bit, some of the things, but most of those are now being, not deferred, but we will only address it in the midterm budget review. I almost want to ask, how confident do you feel that this will happen?
Okay, so the quote, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So my philosophy about this is the things we see now is, in terms of the crisis, not significantly different from what we've seen in previous crises. Mm-hmm. So it is in a certain sense a repeat. Either be the Great Depression, be it crash market crashes in the past, other economic issues in the past. So let me just go back. I love biology. And so in the study of biology, Darwin indicated that the species, the animal, the human species, who is able to survive best, survive because of innovation and collaboration. Mm-hmm. So we may have these things on the budget every year because we need them every year. What we see happening out there is not only dependent on the government. I think too many of us think the solution needs to come from government or from elsewhere. The issue about collaboration and innovation applies to all of us. Mm-hmm. So this budget, in a sense, speaks to the individual and the small business to say, how am I going to innovate? How am I going to change my business to create different products, different services? How do I going to up my service levels? Mm-hmm. And so for me, the focus is not so much on asking the minister, what are you going to do about this? This for me is something that's coming back to us, because the only difference, and that is what Gandhi has said, if you be the change that you want to see. And just the last point, collaboration, PPPs, public-private partnerships. That is a typical good example of collaboration. But it will not work if it's not being done in terms of the initial requirements, mm-hmm. the objectives, and the unity of purpose, as the minister also said. Yeah. So we need to take hands in this regard. Not physically, we're in COVID time, but we need to collaborate and find ways where we can join forces, where we can find new ways of doing business. That is then touching on a discussion we can probably have just after this question of you, the correlation between the health and the education allocation. Mm-hmm. that for me is a point that I think we need to discuss also. But let us first conclude with this point.
Okay. So let me just, in terms of my time, do I have 6 minutes? Is it 6 minutes? Wow, time has certainly flown. So let me do this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eddie, for answering that question. I know that the others probably also want to say something, but let me move on so that we don't miss some of the crucial points here. So, Eddie, do you want to quickly talk about that link, or shall I just move?
Just one point.
Okay.
Yeah. So for me, the focus on health is fine, but I would have liked a more expanded focus on education, like Klaus referred to, because we need to create more entrepreneurs, and we can do that through many ways, but education is one of it.
Okay. Klaus, what should the average Namibian take away from this budget? And I think also just think about what is a positive in this budget that you would like to highlight?
Okay, positive, of course, there are no tax increases. Although I think also on the tax side, there are many opportunities to enhance tax collection. We have all these VAT zero rated food stuff that is not targeted on the poor. It was meant to support the poor, but it's definitely not, because the poor often don't even have access to these items, bread, milk, and so on and so forth. I think we need to review it, and that would mean, of course, for those who are better off and buy these items, that they have to pay more. But if it can be put to good use, I think it makes sense. Then also, same as was mentioned, government subsidizes it by more than 2 billion. That is paid by taxpayers that are already paying for their own medical insurance.
Yes.
In addition, paying for the public servants medical aid scheme. And especially with SEMAS also, it's a flat rate, irrespective of your income level or salary level in the public service, you pay the same rate. I think if we talk about inequality, and so we need to change to a percentage contribution, that you contribute whatever, 3-5% of your salary. So that would lessen the burden on the lower incomes, and the higher income take more responsibility. So there's a lot of in the budget that can be changed, and we really need to change it now, because we are talking about most of these issues latest since 2016, when we had to adjust budgets and the wage bill, and nothing really has happened. Also leveraging state assets, movable, immovable assets, natural resources, fishing quotas, licenses that are currently benefiting individuals rather than the whole society, provides additional resources. It's mentioned all here, but I think we need to get serious to put, let's say, meat to it and then implement and make decisions, and not just mention it in the budget statements and in the mid-year review. But we really need to change some of these, and they have been on the agenda since many years.
Yeah. Okay. Jess, anything?
No, I just want to agree, and I just also want to say I think we need to keep in mind that this is really a difficult budget, and to crunch the numbers is really difficult. And for me, a positive is I think the Honourable Minister was probably realistic. It's some of the numbers, it's large decreases in revenue that they are talking about, and it seems to be realistic, and that is a positive for me. And I also think we sometimes tend to look at the big figures, the 10 billions and the 20 billions, but sometimes by the things that Klaus has mentioned, like urban and rural development, and changing small things in schools that maybe not cost that huge amounts of money, but it can make, in the end, a huge difference in people's lives.
Okay. Eddie, anything positive from your side? I know you've spoken about tax. So
Yeah, and I think I've said enough about that. What we see from the budget at a different level is a country with heart for the poor and heart for those who don't have the benefits of a properly fitted residence with clean water and all the luxuries. So that's very important to note here. But with saying that, I also want to say I think the emphasis is a bit too much on health and too little on education, because there it could have mattered more for the future.
Okay. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this discussion. Unfortunately, we only have a limited time to discuss this. I think what I would like to sign off with is that the minister mentioned about the king, and that king was a king that he was a good ruler, but he was also a ruler that cared. And I think once we move from that standpoint where we care for what we for our citizens, it's very easy to rally the citizens. And I would like to see, whenever we're in crisis, that we rally, but also in good times, that we rally and that everybody benefits. There should be fairness, there should be honesty, there should be transparency, all those nice things. And I would like to applaud the minister for being courageous in tabling a budget such as this during the challenging times. And we wish him well. I think he also mentioned that he'll be a good steward and that he has made a pledge that he will take good care of what is entrusted to him. So I would like now to sign off and say thank you very much for sharing the time with us. I also like to thank my panelists. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate your time and also your input. And I would like to thank Nedbank and Simonis Storm for making this live stream possible. So a huge thank you to you, and enjoy your afternoon or evening.